quite all right that you didn't get all the way through. You got through about verse 26, looking at Eli's sons, the problems with Hophni and Phinehas, and that's going to continue to build as we go through. You've already drawn good contrast between Hophni and Phinehas and Hannah, and then also Hophni and Phinehas and Samuel. And the contrast between Eli's sons and Samuel, again, only going to continue to grow as we go forward. So there are 4 accusatory questions that are brought up in verses 27 through 29. In verse 27, there came a man of God to Eli and brought these accusations to him. So you remember that Eli already knew that his sons were a problem. All but the most uninvolved of parents is going to know if their kids are a problem. And he certainly does know that. Just a few verses before, he had already rebuked his sons in saying that he had heard of their evil dealings from all the people. This was not an isolated complaint. These were things that he was hearing from everybody, from their whole community. They were a very big problem. And we do see him rebuke them, and that's all that you can really expect a parent to do, I guess. But Eli is not painted in a flattering light in this. And in some of these descriptions, we feel some sympathy for him, as we should. But also, Eli is not completely innocent here. This is not necessarily the case of a parent who has done the very best that he could, been completely righteous and blameless in all that he did, and his sons still turned away from God. Eli is complicit in a lot of ways. And you talked last week about how he shared in some of the sin and some of the dishonor as they were dishonoring God through those sacrifices. And so a man of God comes to Eli and delivers a word from the Lord about his sons. And we've got these 4 accusatory questions that God says, "Did I indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt?" So Eli is part of the priestly line, appeared to his father Levi, his ancestor Levi. And what's the significance of that? What's God saying here? Why does Eli care if God has appeared to Levi? Mark.
Just evidentiary statements about the final thing he's going to say.
Yeah. Sure, he's definitely setting up for the bigger accusations. You might remember in Malachi a lot later when God is delivering this word to the unfaithful priests there, that he says, "I made a special covenant with Levi." Of course, there's a covenant with the whole of the people, with all of Israel, but a special covenant with Levi to fill a special role within the nation. Levi is supposed to be leading the people in sacrifices, in knowledge of the Word of God, in directing them spiritually so that the people might better know God. And they weren't doing that. And in Malachi, God has some very harsh words for the priests who are not acting the way that they should, who do not have the relationship with God that they absolutely need to. We have the same sort of thing here. God saying, "I appeared to Levi, I told him what he ought to do." And the second of these accusatory questions is, "Did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest?" Again, these are rhetorical questions. They don't need an answer. He absolutely did choose Levi for this role. But a special role and a special opportunity doesn't come without responsibility. You don't get to be a priest and just do whatever you feel like. You need to respect God's covenant and God's word. And that's something that Eli's sons and to a lesser extent, I suppose, Eli himself were not doing. The third one being, why do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings? In what way is this true? Gary.
One thing, the fat or the meat that was being offered was supposed to be burned to God. They were keeping all that they wanted for all of that.
Yeah.
One way they were scorning the sacrifice, not following the word.
Yeah, they were not following the instruction that God gave. You take this fat, you burn it before the Lord, yet they were keeping it for themselves and eating it themselves. Well, they might ask, and we might ask, what's the difference? Why does God care? But we don't get to ask that question. Why does God care? Well, that's what he commanded. It really doesn't matter. That is what God told them to do, therefore they ought to do it. And God said, you are scorning my sacrifices and offerings by not carrying them out in the way that I have commanded you. Now, it is important for us to note that Eli and his sons were offering sacrifices and offerings to the Lord. They had not completely stopped doing that. But it has never been enough for God that people just offer something to him. All the way back to Cain and Abel, we have the concept of an acceptable sacrifice and a scorned sacrifice, one that God will not accept, and that holds true all the way through.
It's like they were taking what they wanted first and giving God leftovers.
Yeah, absolutely. And God knows that that's happening, and he's not happy with it. And it has gone on for a long time, and they've gotten away with it, so they think. But God is still unhappy with them, and there's going to be a judgment upon them. Gary.
Even when the people that were coming offering the sacrifices knew what was supposed to be done, they were forcing them to give it that anyway.
Yeah.
Even people with a good conscience, they were ignoring.
Yeah, what a sad thing to note there, and I think y'all mentioned that last week too, and I like that. It's worth emphasizing because you had people who were coming to bring their sacrifices, and the priests are offering them, and these people are saying, hold on a sec, that's not what we're supposed to do. They know better than the priests do, and then the priests are forcing them to sin against God. That's not a very good testimony to the respect and honor that God deserves. This goes to show that even though we are into a different book now, we've moved on from Judges and we're into 1 Samuel, the statement said in Judges of everyone did what was right in his own eyes, there's no king in Israel, that has not mysteriously gone away just because we're now in 1 Samuel. That is what the people are doing. That's what the priests are doing. And yes, there are some righteous people. Hannah was a great example of that. And obviously there were some who knew better enough to call out Hophni and Phinehas for the way that they were trying to sin. But by and large, Israel was still rejecting God. The fourth accusatory question, God says, why do you honor your sons above me? That's pointed. And in what way is this true? How is Eli honoring his sons above God? So we don't see Eli, bringing sacrifices to his son and offering things for them and worshiping them. So how is he actually doing this? Sue. Yeah. He wasn't correcting them. He was allowing them to do what they wanted to do. It wasn't important enough to respect God and his word, and so his sons go forward unrestrained. How do we reconcile that with what we read earlier, that he does rebuke them in verses 22 through 25? How do we reconcile that? Yeah.
It took the people to bring it up,
Yeah.
repetitively. So it's one thing when you see something wrong in your own child and you correct them, but to have other people tell you there's something wrong with your children,
Yeah.
it's a different level.
Yeah, it takes a lot of people from a lot of, from the whole community around. Eli has heard this over and over again, and only now does he finally start to say something. Yeah, it's not the greatest look here, for sure. And there's also, some implication here that he's more worried about the reputation issue than he is about the actual sin that they are committing. He says some of the right things here, but don't let that lull us into a sense of complacency. It is possible to sometimes say the right things and even to offer a rebuke that uses all the right words. But if you've not been consistent, if you've let it go on too long, if you've waited until there's enough of an outcry from your community around you before you're saying anything, then God knows the difference. God knows that you're not really concerned with the affront and the dishonor and disrespect that's been given to God. You're more wanting to make sure that your kids aren't embarrassing you. And there is a difference. What Eli should have done is when he sees his sons doing something shocking like that, he should have immediately rebuked them and said, "You do not do this to God. You do not sin in this way. You ought to know better." But he's let this go on far too long. Yeah, Sue.
Even ask them, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
That's not correct. Why are you doing that?
Yeah. It's the impotent kind of rebuke here and we see this sometimes with parents who have never had a very good control over their kids, who've never been able to really rebuke them, is they ask them in that exasperated way, "Why are you doing that?" But there's never been real respect there. There's never been a real ability to lead their children. And we say, okay, his kids are adults now. His kids, are out of Eli's house. And that's true. But still, there's a long history behind all of this. Why have they not learned better? Why do they not respect their father enough? Why do they not respect God enough? These things don't happen overnight. Okay?
Well, they should have been removed from their office,
Yeah.
and they should have been stoned for sleeping with women at the temple door.
Right. So Eli's not following through with what needs to be done. He's not taking this as seriously as he even sounds like he is. And so God knows the difference. Okay. So, yeah, Mark.
The people weren't doing it either, they were just complaining as well.
Right.
And, you can extend all of this stuff to us as well. That God will tell us, you know better. And, even in our own personal lives, when we sin, God could easily say, you know better.
Mm-hmm.
But under the covenant we have now, God has extended that redemptive path that either they didn't see back then or they just didn't care about. God wants us to care about those things.
Yeah. This does lead us to an interesting application that we need to be careful what we are tolerating within our midst. And that's true even if we're kind of making the complaints of, I can't believe he's doing that. He ought to know better. Even if there's kind of some of the right words, when we tolerate sin, when we allow it to go unpunished, when we don't make as big of a deal of it as we should, God knows the difference. Sin is serious. And we ought to be patient with each other. We ought to work long and hard with each other to improve. But we also ought not to to tolerate rebellion and allow that to stand within our midst. We're not going to do that one just yet. Hold on. So Eli's sons are an abomination before God. They've committed all sorts of sins. God has made all these accusatory questions. And is he going to allow Eli's sons to just continue in this sin without consequences forever? Obviously not. This is not going to continue. He says, "Far be it from me." He says, those who dishonor God, those who honor God, I will honor. Those who despise me, I will lightly esteem, or I will disdain or dishonor. And so there's a good opportunity here for us to contrast that Hannah, in her song, in her prayer, she's speaking to the righteousness of God, how God is able to assess and judge and lift up the humble and tear down the arrogant. But Eli and his sons, they don't have that same respect for God. And how ironic is it that Eli was rebuking Hannah for what he thought was unrestrained drunkenness and bad behavior before the Lord, when she's exhibited a lot better behavior than he ever has in this. In this whole account, Eli is a mixed bag at best. And that's not flattering for him at all. Okay, anything else you want to... Yes, so there's a prophecy here. Let's talk about that. There's a prophecy in this message from the man of God about a faithful priest to come. God saying, because Hophni and Phinehas are sinning in this way, I'm going to cut off your strength. I'm going to cut off the strength of your father's house. There will not be an old man in your house. You are not going to continue as a line of priests forever. This is going to be given over to somebody else. And that faithful priest, in verse 35, I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed forever. What is this talking about? Who is the faithful priest?
Coming of Christ.
Okay, so in the grand sense, yes, absolutely. There's a smaller sense first. Zadok, yes. So this, like many prophecies, has a fulfillment in stages. So in the destruction of Eli's house, it doesn't happen overnight. Even when the judgment comes, it doesn't happen overnight. First, we are going to see Hophni and Phinehas die in chapter 4, followed by Eli himself. Then in chapter 22, we'll see 85 of Eli's descendants put to a very violent death by Saul. We see one of them survive, Abiathar survives. He is priest for years to follow, but he supports Adonijah when he tries to succeed David as king. And Adonijah, of course, is not successful. Solomon becomes king, and what do you think Solomon thinks about the priest who is supporting the wrong king? He really wants to put Adonijah to death. But because Adonijah was so faithful to David, and because he has done good things in his service to God, he merely expels him from the priesthood and exiles him, and a new priest takes over. So that is Zadok, and that the priests now come from his line. All this is within the family of Levi. That has not changed, but the particular family of priests here has changed. This is to be marked by a sign. God says, you will know that I'm going to do this, even though a lot of these things are going to happen after you die. The sign that it will come to pass is what?
Both the sons die on the same day.
Both of your sons will die on the same day. And Eli would get to see that. So when he sees Hophni and Phinehas die on the very same day, it becomes very certain to him God is not going to allow his line, his legacy to endure. And that's a really sad thing for him. Particularly as people approach the end of their lives. We see Eli as an old man here. We start thinking a lot about our legacy. What am I leaving behind? What are my descendants going to do? How have I changed the world? And God says, you've changed this community, you've changed this nation in a very negative way, and so I reject you. And I reject your house. And your legacy is that you will be really forgotten. We remember Eli and his sons, but mostly as a negative example here. And we don't want to say that Eli was all bad. I don't know that anybody is all bad and makes all bad choices. He has raised Samuel here, and he's taught Samuel something. He is serving as a priest, but he is at best a mixed bag, and God very obviously does reject him here. So Zadok is going to be the fulfillment. All that will happen in stages and will take some generations to accomplish. But then, of course, the faithful priest who fulfills that even more is how we get to Jesus in being the perfect prophet, priest, and king. And Scott mentioned that last week as well, that we have a lot of these shadows of what Jesus would come to be. Samuel serves as prophet and priest at least, king only in a very abstract sense of leadership before the people. David gets to be, and Solomon both are shadows of that as well, though imperfect. Moses was a shadow of it. But Jesus is going to be the fulfillment of what the perfect prophet should be, the perfect priest should be, the perfect king should be. And of course, that will take a long time to come to fruition. Okay. Question 5, what impressions do you have about Eli? Why is it ironic that his eyesight grows dim in chapter 3, verse 2? Yeah, Mark.
Turn a blind eye to this.
Yeah. Right. He has turned a blind eye to the actions of his sons, and he is very literally going blind. And that's not necessarily because he was struck blind by God. Nothing there says that. But the fact that the detail is mentioned serves a couple of purposes. It's going to help explain why Samuel would think that Eli is calling for him in the middle of the night. That would be quite believable with somebody who is not able to see very well, and it is dark, and there's a problem, and he needs help. But also that it's a symbol here for Eli's failing leadership, for his failing spiritual vision, and his oversight as he's supposed to be leading the people.
Well, there's one to be interesting in that day. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. Prophetic visions were not widespread.
Mm-hmm.
Corruption had basically closed God off to him.
Yeah.
So in that way, also, he was, things were becoming him. He wasn't getting visions on Fox.
Right. Yeah, so lest you think we're making too big of a thing out of that detail, like that's paired with this statement that the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There's no frequent vision there, true literally in Eli's eyes, but no frequent vision from the Lord to Eli or really to anybody else in the nation. Because here's what we need to remember. Eli and his sons are not an exception in the nation. They are not the most egregious and the most outrageous of the people. They're one example of many, of an attitude that is pervasive throughout the nation. And so all of this corruption, all of this evil that has spread so far has led God to withdraw his word and withdraw his revelation to the people to a great degree. Not totally. He's not entirely left them without any revelation. It doesn't say the word of the Lord was absent. It says it was rare. And a lot of that is because they just don't care. they don't want the word of the Lord. They're not listening to it anyway. So what's the point? Mark?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And just as a kind of a contrast to Judges, when I read through Judges, I kept thinking to myself, well, how much do they really know about God? You know, are they doing their yearly reading of the scriptures
Yeah.
like they're supposed to do? You know, are they really getting into it, or what's happening? Why are they just doing what they want to do? But we see here some many years after that, after the beginning of the entry into the land, that they are doing it, and the people know when things are not right, but they're
Yeah.
just not doing anything, I guess. But I'm not, you know, I'm not saying anything about it other than that's just kind of what human nature can become.
Right.
When you want to make God into your own image.
Yeah, and that is interesting because Judges leaves us with the impression that like maybe they've forgotten about God entirely. Maybe they literally know nothing about the covenant at all, and it seems that that's not completely true. Of course, when you're dealing with something as large as a nation, you've got a lot of different families, a lot of different towns, a lot of different things going on where surely there are some people who have forgotten God and who are not responsive at all to the covenant. But as a nation, they have not yet completely forgotten about God. This isn't like later on where, I forget which king it is, that they discover the law, and they're like, oh, look at these things that are in the law. We've completely forgotten about what God told us to do. We have these feasts we're supposed to observe. We have these, obviously it had been gone for generations by that point if they couldn't even remember the old people in their community who were like, I remember when we did that when I was a kid. People don't remember anymore. So it's been gone for generations by that point. It doesn't seem to be the case here. There is a viable priesthood. They are still worshiping God in some way. Eli and his sons are not worshiping some idol. This isn't a temple to Dagon or anything like that. So they know God to a degree. And there are people who know some of the details about the covenant in what they're supposed to be doing for God. They're just not doing it. They just don't care enough about it. And so the revelation from God is rare. The word of the Lord is not coming to them. There's no frequent vision. You see this drifting apart of God and his people as the people care less and less about what he's commanded them to do. Anything else you want to bring up before we get into the vision that God gives to Samuel? I guess before we talk about that, we have several things both in chapter 2, 26, and then at the end of chapter 3, 19 through 21, that talk about how Samuel was growing up in the Lord. That kind of a similar statement that's said about Jesus, that he was growing in wisdom and stature, favor with God and man. Samuel is growing up physically and growing up in the Lord. Question 6 is, what excuses could Samuel have had for not continuing to grow in the Lord?
You might believe he's not the chosen one to follow up.
Yeah?
Be a priest.
Yeah? Absolutely. What else? Lauren? Yeah. As we're sitting here ragging on Eli and talking about how he has not raised his sons well, remember that he is kind of raising Samuel. So Samuel could very easily turn out like Hophni and Phinehas. He's not. And that is more of a testament to Samuel than it is to Eli. Now, again, certainly, we don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. Eli has clearly taught Samuel something good, but Samuel's been able to take this more seriously than even Eli does. And that is impressive for a child.
You still have the influence of Elkanah and Hannah.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Here she was there, and she, they inspired him and should
Yes.
follow.
Yeah, absolutely. He's got this influence from his parents as they see him, but there's lots of opportunity for this to go wrong, and it doesn't, which is impressive. Andrea?
There's the verse that when God is telling Eli what he's going to do, I'm sorry, when God is talking to Samuel, he's telling him he's going to invite his family. He said that he's never going to forgive them. Does that mean that they're not going to be with him when they die? Like spiritually wise? Like that really caught my eye.
He's saying that there's no way to avoid this judgment now. So a lot of times there's these warnings, and that's what the warning from the man of God before is, of your sons are a mess. Your sons are very evil and not obeying me like they should, and you need to change things, and they need to change things. And there's a lot of times opportunity when a message from the Lord comes showing you an end that it can still be averted if you repent and come back to God. By this point, when God is speaking to Samuel, this is not a warning about something that could happen. This is a promise about what will happen. Even if Eli says now, okay, I've got to do better. Okay, I need to get my sons in line. Even if Hophni and Phinehas say, okay, we'll try to do better, their fate is sealed now. They are rejected as God's priests. They are going to die, and their legacy is not going to continue. So that's the idea there, that this is a distinction between something that could still be averted versus something that is for sure going to take place. Yeah.
As a parent, don't you get to a point where if your kids aren't listening to you, why are you still held accountable? If they're adults, I'm assuming in this story, like, there's so much a parent can do for their kids, and I still going to be held accountable for that?
The problem with Eli here is he did not do everything he could. That he was not restraining his kids. Well, it is true. We don't have control over our kids to force them to go down the path that we want them to go down. And it is very possible, and it happens too much, that you can have righteous parents who raise their children up in exactly the way they ought to go, and the children don't go the way they ought to go. They make a different choice. And that is a testament to the fact that we are allowed to make our own choices. I can say with certainty about my own parents, they raised me up to follow God. And if I ever fall away, it won't be their fault. It'll be my own. And that is true for a lot of people. What God is saying about Eli is, this isn't true about you. You are partially responsible for what happened here because you didn't raise them the way that you should. So this is a good warning to us that as we consider our influence on our children, on our brethren around us, on other people, sometimes we resort too quickly to the statement and the excuse that, well, I can't control what they do. I can't control how my kids are going to behave. I can't control what my brethren do. To a degree that's true, but don't give up on your influence. Don't give up on your responsibility to do everything you can to teach them to live right. Lauren? Yeah. Sure. And also important to note that the particular judgment that's being talked about here is the rejection of them as priests, the removal of their line and legacy as God's priests and God's servants going forward. Whether Eli repented of his failure to lead his children and whether he is accepted by God in eternity is up to God to decide. There's I don't know enough information to necessarily say what Eli's fate in that sense is. The point being is that their role as priests, they don't get to be priests anymore. They don't get to, and to a broader degree, Eli's house doesn't get to be priests forevermore as they would have been otherwise. Mark?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here. It was normalized that God, we're going to see that here in the next chapter. God was just another God to them. He was another idol. He was an idol. He became an idol to them. He became their tool. And we see that in the coming chapters. They're lost. And that's the difference that we see between the faith, and this is what you've been bringing up, the faith of what Eli had and the faith of Hannah. Let's not forget that Hannah was seeing her son. This faith that he has isn't from Eli.
Right.
It's from her. It's from his mother. She's bringing that great faith to him, telling him, once a year at least, God is God. He is the one who's going to bring all these things to fruition. I gave you to him, and that's my opinion anyway.
Yeah.
Is if there's any one person in here, it's Hannah who's bringing this to him because it's not coming from Eli. He's teaching him the mechanics of it, but only in the sense that God is our tool and He's going to do everything for us. And Hannah's saying God does everything. You have to give yourself to Him on His terms. That's the only thing I can think of, and that's my opinion about it.
Well, it is the different factor when you compare Hophni and Phinehas to Samuel. Why do they turn out so differently? Of course, everyone gets to make their own choices, so there's that. But, Eli is not giving the best version of things to his sons or to Samuel. So probably that's Hannah's influence. I agree with the assessment that it's Hannah. And for her seeing him once a year or so, she's got pretty good influence, obviously, even with that limited interaction, that she's able to instill this in him and to fill this gap that Eli is not communicating appropriately. So, Gary.
I'm just thinking, they had the law of Moses, right? They had God's word. And an honest heart and God's word is all that's needed in every circumstance. You might say, like, if you come from a bad family, we brought up a good family, the kids might still go off. That. But a lot of kids are in a bad family and they come out correctly, obeying God.
Right.
We all have the same book.
Yeah.
And I kind of picture Samuel, since he's a priest, studying the Word of God.
Yeah.
So if he has a good heart, maybe he received a lot of that from his mother.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
The Word of God, he had the Word of God. Eli had the Word of God.
Yeah.
And Samuel was just different hearts.
Yeah. Absolutely. There's a transformative effect on those who are willing to hear and obey. And Samuel obviously is reacting very differently than Eli and Hophni and Phinehas are. So in chapter 3, Samuel is sleeping, and it's deep in the night, and he hears a voice saying, "Here I am." Yes. So the first thing, "Here I am," and so Samuel gets up in a rush and he runs over to Eli. And of course, as we mentioned before, the thing that Samuel is probably thinking here is, well, something has happened in the night. Eli needs help. It's very dark. It says Eli, could barely see, But if you can barely see, then it's going to be even harder to see while it's so dark. And so he probably needs help. He's an old man by this point. So Samuel runs to him and he says, "Here I am, for you called me." And Eli said, "I didn't call you. Go back to sleep. Go back to bed." The kids obviously heard something in a dream. He's made something up here, or he's mistaken. But then God calls out again, and this time says, "Samuel." And Samuel gets up and runs to Eli. He says, "Here I am, for you called me." Very dutiful in all of this. And Eli says, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." Samuel did not yet know the Lord, it says, to recognize the voice of the Lord and recognize that this was the word of the Lord being revealed to him. So then God calls Samuel a third time. He runs to Eli and says, "Here I am, for you called me." And Eli realizes something's going on. That Samuel is not stupid, and even if he's a kid, that there's no reason for him to continue running to Eli if he's not hearing something. And so he says, you're hearing the voice of the Lord. And he says, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" So Samuel goes back to bed, and God calls that fourth time. But this time, it says the Lord came and stood before Samuel. So a vision as well, or an appearance as well, that he has come and he's saying, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel responds, just as dutifully, "Speak, for your servant hears." Now, all of this is, it's hard not to smile. I'm imagining a kid who's hearing a voice he doesn't recognize and who is this eager to do what he's supposed to do. But the smile fades. We see that God is not holding back. God does not mince words with Samuel, even speaking to this child. He says, "Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which the 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle." That's common phrasing for anticipating a punishment. So on that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. I declare to him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. So again, however much we want to paint Eli in a positive light and say, he couldn't control his sons, he couldn't force them to do anything that they didn't want to do, this is God's judgment of the matter, that Eli did not restrain his sons, that Eli did not do what he was supposed to do. Therefore, I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. Eli's house has been rejected as priest. So Samuel lays until morning, gets up, and obviously doesn't want to tell Eli about this. Because what kid would? This is not a fun conversation. And Eli is a father figure to him. And so Eli says, "What was it that the Lord told you? Do not hide anything from me." He sees the hesitation, and I think Eli knows really what has been said already, because this isn't the first time Eli's heard this. Eli's already had a revelation from the man of God telling him that his sons are trouble. And so he says, "May God do so to you and more if you hide anything from me of all that he told you." And so Samuel tells him everything. And Eli's response is, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." Which is all that you can say, but man, I don't know. If he had had that respect for the Lord and had raised his children better, then he could have at least been blameless in this, and maybe his kids would have turned out better, but he didn't. So the contrast grows that Eli and Hophni and Phinehas are falling, Samuel is rising, Samuel grows, the Lord is with him, let none of his words fall to the ground, and we are launched very quickly as Samuel is next time we see him, he's going to be grown up, going to be an adult, And the word of the Lord, the word of Samuel, has come to all Israel. It's the word of the Lord through Samuel that he is getting this revelation and getting a word from the Lord to deliver to the people. And where it was once rare, now it is common through Samuel. Next week, we will go on to lesson 3 and see some of what Samuel has to tell the people.
Stevens will be opening us up in our first prayer, and Brother Chris McClure will be leading us in our closing prayer. Brother Steve?
Oh, thy word is a lamp to my feet and a light unto my path. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. When I feel afraid, I think I've lost my way. Still, you're there right beside me. Nothing I will fear.